My sister, Rachel, had always been the eccentric one. Her passion for art drove her to immerse herself in a world of colors, brushes, and canvases, often leading her to seek solitude where her creativity could flow unimpeded. 10 months ago, she found a solution. A cheap 3-room apartment on the outskirts of town, in a rundown neighborhood. She rented it solely as a studio, a place to store her art supplies and finish her paintings. The apartment wasn't a place to live. It was more like an escape. I, on the other hand, was just starting my life as an adult. Fresh out of college, I'd landed my first job, but with a meager paycheck that wouldn't stretch far enough for my own place. That's when Rachel offered me her studio apartment to stay in until I could afford my own place. I was hesitant at first. She warned me about the high crime rate in the area, but I couldn't resist the allure of having my own space, even temporarily. Besides, I was grateful for her help. When I arrived, the apartment was dim and cold, filled with a faint smell of paint and turpentine. The walls were covered with half-finished canvases. Rachel's vivid, abstract interpretations of faces, landscapes, and odd dreamlike scenes that made you feel as if you'd been pulled into a different world. I set down my bags, taking in the peculiar atmosphere of the place. My sister had told me that it wasn't exactly cozy, but I thought a few personal touches might make it feel more like home. That evening, after unpacking my things, I locked the door with the key and put the chain on, just as Rachel had advised. I made myself a simple meal of chicken and rice, read a book for a while, and eventually, feeling the fatigue of the day settling in, I checked the door one last time before heading to bed. The place felt strange, but I chalked it up to the unfamiliarity of a new space. But that night, something happened that I couldn't explain. It was the dead of night, and I was abruptly pulled from sleep by the sound of a door opening. Groggy and disoriented, I glanced at the clock on my phone. It was around 2 or 3 in the morning. I froze, listening intently as the soft creak of the front door echoed through the stillness of the apartment. I thought it must be Rachel. Perhaps she had forgotten something important or had come to finish one of her paintings. Artists, after all, are known for their unpredictable schedules. Besides, who else would have a key to the apartment? My mind struggled to rationalize her presence, convincing myself that it was normal for her to stop by unannounced. I heard her footsteps as they made their way to the studio room next to mine. Then there was a strange murmur, as if she were talking to herself. Occasionally, a quiet laugh drifted through the walls. I rolled my eyes, half amused and half annoyed. Artists, I mumbled, turning over in bed. Sleepiness took over, and soon I drifted off again. When morning arrived, the apartment was silent. Rachel must have left early, I thought. As I got ready for work, I noticed that her presence from the night before had left no trace. No art supplies scattered about, no brushes cleaned and left to dry. It was as if no one had been there at all. I shook it off, attributing it to my foggy memory from waking up in the middle of the night. But the strange occurrence nagged at me throughout the day, a quiet unease growing in the pit of my stomach. The next evening, I returned to the apartment, a sense of dread beginning to build as I approached the door. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that I'd simply imagined Rachel's visit. She'd probably come by to check on me, noticed I was asleep, and left quietly. There was no need to worry, I reasoned. But as night fell, an unsettling atmosphere began to creep in. I repeated my routine, locking the door, double-checking the chain, and trying to ignore the sensation of being watched. I cooked a small meal, sat with a book, and eventually, as the clock ticked past midnight, I went to bed hoping for an undisturbed night's sleep. But once again, in the early hours, I was awakened by the sound of the front door. My eyes snapped open, my body tense with anticipation. The same soft footsteps echoed through the hallway, stopping outside the studio. I could hear the faint murmur again, mumbling incoherent words, and a low, breathy chuckle. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. I could hear the sound as if it were happening just outside my door. My throat felt tight, and a chilling thought crossed my mind. What if this wasn't my sister? My eyes darted to the door. Slowly, I gathered the courage to step out into the hallway. The murmuring stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence. My heart pounded as I inched my way towards the studio. The door was ajar, and I nudged it open further. The room was empty, just as it had been before. The canvases leaned against the walls, Rachel's strange, vivid images watching me in the dim light. There was no sign of anyone having been there. A deep, creeping dread settled in as I closed the door, backed away, and returned to bed, my mind reeling. Something was very wrong here. The next morning, as I prepared to leave for work, a realization hit me with a force that made me shiver. The chain was unlocked. I distinctly remembered locking it the previous night. I had checked it, pulled on it even to make sure it was secure. The implications of the unlocked chain flooded my mind with horror. If it was off when I awoke, then someone or something had been inside the apartment. I bolted out of the apartment without looking back. The idea of staying there another night felt unbearable, as if the very walls held secrets I was not meant to uncover. I needed answers, some rational explanation that could put my mind at ease. That evening, I went to my parents' house, where Rachel happened to be visiting. My voice trembled as I recounted the events of the past 2 nights. I expected her to laugh it off or tell me I was overreacting, but instead, a shadow fell over her face. "I never went to the apartment," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do you mean? You didn't come by at all?" "No, I haven't been there in weeks." A cold silence settled between us. My mother, overhearing, gave us both a worried look, but Rachel looked strangely distant. Then, as if remembering something, she glanced at me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. "There's something I never told you," she said slowly, hesitating. Rachel's hands trembled as she revealed a memory that had been buried for months. When she first rented the apartment, she'd felt a strange presence there, a feeling she couldn't shake, no matter how much she tried to rationalize it. She'd sometimes hear soft whispers, laughter that seemed to echo through the rooms even when she was alone. She brushed it off, convinced it was just her overactive imagination as an artist, but it lingered. One night, as she worked on a particularly large canvas, she had fallen asleep in the studio. She woke up to find herself surrounded by her own paintings, their eyes seeming to stare back at her in the dim light. That's when she saw something. A shadowy figure standing near the door, just barely visible, watching her. She couldn't move, paralyzed with fear as the figure slowly approached her. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished, leaving her alone in the eerie silence of the studio. She left the apartment that night, locking the door behind her, and had never stayed there after dark again. "But it's just a feeling, right?" I stammered, desperate to find a rational explanation. Maybe it's all in our heads, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Before I left that night, Rachel gave me one last piece of advice. "There's a canvas in the studio. It's hidden in the closet. I never finished it. Don't look at it. Just leave it there." Curiosity gnawed at me, and against my better judgment, I returned to the apartment, determined to find that canvas. I had to know what she was hiding. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the familiar scent of paint and dust filling my nostrils. The apartment was silent, but I could feel an almost tangible tension in the air, as if something was waiting for me. I moved slowly toward the closet in the studio, reaching out with a trembling hand. Inside, buried beneath old rags and sketchbooks, was the unfinished canvas. I pulled it out, propping it up against the wall, and shone my flashlight on it. The painting was incomplete, but what I saw froze me to the core. It was a dark, shadowy figure, its face hidden, standing just inside a doorway. And the strangest part? It looked exactly like the front door of the apartment. As I stared at the canvas, I felt a cold breath on my neck, and a whisper filled the room, so soft it could have been the wind. "Welcome home." The whisper lingered in the silence of the room, faint and almost playful, like a chill that crept under your skin and settled into your bones. My heart hammered as I stumbled backward, unable to take my eyes off the shadowy figure on the canvas. It was as if it were alive, as if the darkness was seeping out of the painting, curling around me like tendrils of smoke. "Welcome home," the whisper had said. I darted out of the studio, slamming the door behind me as if that would somehow contain whatever presence lurked within. I clutched the doorframe, struggling to steady my breath. My mind raced with fragments of Rachel's warnings and the strange events I had experienced over the past few days. But as I stood there, forcing myself to breathe, another realization began to creep in. The apartment was too quiet. Every sound seemed amplified, every creak of the floorboards stretching out into the silence like an unspoken threat. I knew I needed to get out of there, but a small, stubborn part of me whispered that I needed to understand what was happening. I couldn't just run. Not yet. I had to face whatever it was. Taking a shaky breath, I opened the door to the studio again. The canvas was still propped up against the wall, the shadowy figure staring back at me from the doorway it inhabited, a twisted mockery of my own experiences in the apartment. There was something different now, though, a faint shimmer near the figure's hand, as if it held something. I leaned closer, and my stomach lurched. It was holding a key. My key. I stumbled back, horrified. I had left my key on the kitchen counter when I came in, but as I ran back to check, my heart sank. It was gone. How could it be in the painting? Panic tightened around me, each second stretching painfully long. I hurriedly turned back to the studio, and that's when I heard it, the familiar sound of the front door creaking open. Someone or something was in the apartment with me. A surge of adrenaline took over, and I darted into the living room, hoping to see the front door ajar, a chance to escape. But to my horror, it was closed and locked tight, the chain dangling as if it had never been latched. Then, from the shadows at the edge of the hallway, a figure emerged. It was dark and featureless, almost like an absence rather than a presence, a distortion in the air that felt impossibly dense. It didn't move toward me. It simply stood there, watching. My legs trembled as I took a step back, and then another. The figure remained still, silent, but I could feel its gaze burning through me. You're not real, I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. This can't be happening. But it was. The figure began to drift forward, slow and deliberate, its movements like the shifting of shadows in candlelight. I scrambled backward, desperate to get away, my mind blank with fear. My only thought was to reach the door, to somehow get past this thing. Just as it seemed the figure would reach me, the apartment lights flickered, and in that momentary burst of brightness, it disappeared. But as darkness reclaimed the room, I knew it wasn't gone. It was hiding, waiting, and it was patient. Shaking, I threw myself into the bedroom and locked the door, as if that flimsy lock could keep whatever it was at bay. I fumbled for my phone, desperate to call Rachel, but my fingers slipped, trembling too much to hit the call button. After what felt like an eternity, she picked up, her voice groggy. "Hello, Rachel, it's here," I whispered, my voice a terrified rasp. There's something in the apartment, something in the painting." There was a pause, and then her voice dropped to a whisper. "I know, I tried to tell you. I didn't want you to see it, but maybe you had to." "Had to?" My voice broke. "Rachel, I'm not staying here another minute. I'm leaving. Listen to me," she cut in. "There's a room in that apartment. A hidden room. It's part of why I stopped going there. I don't know if you can find it, but if you do, maybe you'll understand." "A hidden room?" I asked, incredulous. "Rachel, this isn't a game. I'm not joking. There's something trapped in that apartment, something I couldn't explain. But I think it's waiting for someone." With that, she hung up, leaving me in the darkened room, my mind racing. A hidden room? It sounded absurd, but I was desperate. Maybe if I found it, I could find a way to stop this nightmare. I took a deep breath, steeling myself before I carefully unlocked the door and stepped back into the hallway. The figure was nowhere to be seen, but the air was thick with tension, an oppressive silence that made my skin crawl. I began searching every corner of the apartment, pressing against the walls, looking for any hint of a hidden space. Finally, behind a tall stack of old canvases in the studio, I felt a faint draft. I pushed the paintings aside and discovered a small door embedded in the wall, almost invisible, like it didn't want to be found. My heart pounded as I reached for the handle. The door opened with a quiet creak, revealing a cramped, dark space beyond. I pulled out my phone, using its flashlight to pierce the darkness, and stepped inside. The air was stale, heavy with dust, as if the room hadn't been opened in decades. The walls were covered in faded wallpaper, curling at the edges, and the only object in the room was a single, worn-out chair facing an empty wall. But what caught my attention were the drawings on the walls, hundreds of them, drawn in faded charcoal and smeared paint. Faces, dozens of them, staring back at me from every inch of the room, expressions frozen in anguish, terror, and despair. A chill ran down my spine. These were not Rachel's drawings. As I scanned the walls, my flashlight caught something scrawled in shaky handwriting across the wall above the chair. It was barely legible, like someone had scratched it in a hurry. He promised me freedom, but I am bound to this place. My hands shook as I read the words. Bound? Who or what was bound to this apartment? Then I noticed a figure drawn in the corner of the room. Unlike the others, it wasn't a face. It was a shadowy shape, much like the one I had seen in the hallway, a figure of darkness. Beneath it, written in small, cramped letters, was a single word. Beware. I backed out of the room, slamming the door shut. My breathing was ragged, my heart pounding. I didn't understand everything, but one thing was clear. This entity, whatever it was tied to the apartment, trapped in the walls and waiting. And it wanted something from me. I stumbled back into the main room, desperate to leave. But as I reached for the door, the lights flickered, casting the apartment in an eerie glow. And then, slowly, the shadow appeared once more, materializing from the darkness like smoke. It stood between me and the exit, blocking my way out. Why are you here? I demanded, my voice breaking. For a moment there was silence. And then, in a voice that seemed to echo from the walls themselves, it whispered, I am bound. And so are you. The words filled me with dread. Bound? What did it mean? I remembered the phrase scrawled on the wall in the hidden room. He promised me freedom. A realization dawned on me. Whoever this spirit was, they had been trapped here, bound to this place. And now it was trying to transfer that bond to me. No, I said, shaking my head. You're not trapping me here. But the shadowy figure moved closer, its form almost merging with mine. I could feel a coldness enveloping me, as if it were trying to pull me into its world. I struggled, resisting with every ounce of strength I had, forcing myself to fight the darkness that threatened to consume me. Then a thought struck me, the canvas, the painting that Rachel had left unfinished. If the spirit was somehow tied to the apartment, maybe destroying that painting could sever its hold. Summoning the last of my courage, I darted back into the studio, grabbed the canvas, and hurled it to the floor. I stomped on it, tearing at the fabric, ripping it apart until the shadowy figure painted on it was nothing more than shreds and scraps. As the painting was destroyed, a wail filled the apartment, a sound that echoed through every corner, shaking the walls and rattling the windows. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the sound stopped. The air grew still, the oppressive weight lifted, and the apartment felt empty.